It's time once again for another thrilling episode of Markout Radio. For the next hour, sit back, pull the stick out of your ass, and enjoy. Be warned though, smarks and internet know-it-alls will be offended, annoyed, and generally pissed off at what's about to happen to your ear holes. You've been warned. Now, Markout Radio.
That's right. Welcome to a Market Radio special. Your boy Dark Fox in the seat again today. And listen, I've got a special treat for y'all. Normally, this is just going to be like a Nitro-specific podcast, but like I said, this is going to be a special. We're going to cover Halloween Havoc 96. And as entertaining as I'm sure you all find it, listening to my bullshit hot takes on watching back Nitro episodes from my youth, I thought I'd bring in, well, listen, I think we can call him an expert. I think we can. Guy Evans, who wrote, what are we calling? Just give me 1 second. I want to get it absolutely 100% right. Nitro, the definitive account of the last wrestling boom. Guy Evans, thank you very much for coming on the show.
Well, thanks. I appreciate it, Dave. And let's be careful about that word expert after what we've seen in 2020. You know, with everything that the experts have told us, that could either be a great compliment or it could be something else. But no, I really appreciate the invite and looking forward to talking to you about Halloween Havoc today.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, and I'm sure that there would be people that would claim that Eric Bischoff is an expert on the wrestling industry. So let's absolutely weigh that with a grain of salt. Now, the thing is that I thought that Halloween Havoc, having the guy on the show would be interesting because even though his book is about Nitro, it is about the rise and fall of WCW in its all its glory in the mid to late 90s. And Halloween Havoc 96 is arguably, I will admit, one of the more iconic pay-per-views that got that whole ball rolling.
Yeah, that's right. And I think what's interesting when you think about Halloween Havoc is I think as outsiders, as fans, as people who followed the product back then, you would sort of categorize, I think, that particular pay-per-view as being perhaps one of the most important events on the WCW calendar. Starrcade, of course, was ostensibly WCW's biggest pay-per-view, and in effect, its kind of version of WrestleMania, I suppose. And then, Halloween Havoc would probably be, depending on how you look at it, maybe number 2, number 3 in that list. But what's interesting is from the standpoint of WCW, and Eric Bischoff in particular has talked about this quite a bit on a number of occasions. Is Halloween Havoc was really the event that they looked at as almost being the pinnacle pay-per-view or the premier pay-per-view on the calendar. Of course, it took place at the MGM Grand in Las Vegas. This was an event that attracted a lot of attention in that particular market. Generally, did very, very well on pay-per-view. You usually had a marquee matchup like the one that we saw on this particular pay-per-view between Hogan and Savage. If you look at the live gates in 1996, I think I'm right in saying that this show produced more revenue from an attendance in terms of the live attendance than any other show. So actually, Halloween Havoc was incredibly important for WCW as a company, and depending on who you listen to and what perspective you take, maybe the most important show on the calendar. So always fun to go back and look at a show like this, because I think that was one of the nice things about the entire WCW era is you had these shows on the calendar, whether it's Bash at the Beach, Super Brawl, Halloween Havoc, these sort of themed pay-per-views that you would look forward to on a yearly basis, and a lot of us have very fond memories of those.
Yeah, I would absolutely agree. Havoc did the same numbers as Uncensored as far as pay-per-view buy rates. It also tied the 96 Bash for pay-per-view buy rates, which is another iconic pay-per-view in the WCW/NWO annals of time. I would absolutely agree. Halloween Havoc was Starrcade was, listen, I grew up being a WCW fan, so I will at times throw the WWF under the bus, but Starrcade dates back to 1983, WrestleMania dates back to 1985, and Vince is well known for ripping off good ideas. So let's call a spade here. Now, in recent years, Havoc has taken an absolute shit kicking. Starrcade and Havoc really get lip service treatment, and only on NXT in WWE's current product. Did you happen to watch the NXT episode of Halloween Havoc this year?
I didn't. To be honest with you, I'm not. I'm not too in tune with the current product at the moment. Maybe you can fill me in, but obviously, I am aware that they have used some of those old names and brought back some of the copyrights that they attained in the WCW purchase. And it's interesting to see how they've done that, because, again, correct me if I'm wrong here, but I think Starrcade, they essentially brought that back to be a series of house shows. Is that right?
Yeah. They brought back Starrcade to be a series of house shows, even though it was one of the first legitimate, and pay-per-views are kind of hard to say, because at the time, pay-per-views were closed circuit television contract deals. And so the cable company, the way it was set up in the United States and in North America in general, these closed circuit cable deals broadcast to other closed circuit locations like theaters or arenas, things like that. Whereas the pay-per-views, we come to know it in actually in your home, didn't start happening until, I believe, I'm going to say probably 86, 87, if I'm probably wrong on the total date there. I'm sure I'll get an email correcting me. But the Halloween Havoc pay-per-view 1996 anyways generated 175,000 buys, which at the time blew out of the water any other pay-per-views that had really gone on, except maybe one or two. And ironically enough, from WCW's camp. WWF was not touching this number at the time. Don't get me wrong, the wrestling industry is going to get a huge influx of new fans soon, but the fact that Halloween Havoc, not being Starrcade, not being the granddaddy as they call it, able to generate this kind of buy rate, even though it was also, as Guy mentions, one of those iconic pay-per-views in WCW's arsenal, it really speaks to how popular WCW was becoming, how popular it already was with its fans, and how many, at this point, Nitro and Raw were essentially swimming in the same pool, stealing the same audience, going back and forth. And the fact that they could generate this many buys, it really speaks to the popularity of WCW, and people were watching, perhaps not always live Nitro, but were clearly watching enough Nitro to know what was happening in a pay-per-view, enough so that 175,000 people went and bought it, and it had a 10,000 audience show with a live gate of $224,660. Pretty impressive shit. I mean, for the mid 90s, those are big numbers.
Well, I think as well, you have to keep in mind that they're doing this on a monthly basis, right? So I think there's a temptation you could compare some of those numbers to perhaps the marquee events today, whether they be the AEW sort of specials that we've seen several times a year, or something in that realm. But obviously the difference is here that every 4 weeks, pretty much WCW and also the WWF had to sell its audience on the idea that this is going to be, the biggest matchup ever, the biggest pay-per-view. You can't miss it because something so important is going to transpire at this event that you're going to, kick yourself if you don't purchase the show. So I think that really speaks to the success creatively of WCW at this particular time, that they were able to actually, if you go back, and of course there are good and bad elements to every show, and a lot of this is so subjective, but if you look at how they maintained the momentum for as long as they did with the NWO storyline, and as long as they were able to sort of keep WCW in that position of being the underdogs, being downtrodden, being beat up upon, for as long as they did, was really quite remarkable. Now, obviously, there's a flip side to that. Once you get into late 98, 99 on your show, Clearly, it was time for certainly a change in direction, and WCW lost a huge amount of its paying audience in its last year and a half of operation, which I think is one of the most overlooked elements sometimes of the WCW story. The extent to which it was able to actually maintain, if you look at those television ratings, a pretty decent, audience who are willing to watch Nitro every Monday, but almost nobody, as compared to 96, 97, first half of 98, almost nobody was actually willing to pay for the product by that point. But certainly at this time, 96, the company has just huge momentum. We're just a few months into the NWO storyline. You have so many interesting creative themes that are sort of bubbling underneath the surface. You have the beginnings of Sting in the rafters, and just the thrilling creative occurrences that come out of that over the next year or so. So just a very exciting time for the company, and a great time to look back on as a fan as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, in the spirit of keeping everything as a caveat, one of the things that I did find doing a little bit of digging was that yes, this pay per view was indeed held in Vegas. Obviously, not the first WCW pay per view to be held there, and far from the last. However, at this point, WCW was becoming a bit of an attraction. And so the MGM Grand actually paid the WCW to be an attraction in much the same way as they pay magicians and musicians to come and be an attraction at a stage that they build for them. In this case, the MGM Grand is something where primarily is being used for sporting events, boxing, different things like that. In this case, WCW got a $200,000 guarantee from the MGM Grand to come and be an attraction. Now, that chef definitely should not to deject from their $224,000 gate. Anything above and beyond that guarantee, that was theirs. And so the fact that their Bash 96 and Uncensored 96 generated $72,000 and $104,000 individually, the fact that this would generate even over twice that, not only speaks to the fact that this was a hot ticket in Vegas, but that the MGM knew what they were doing by bringing in WCW and this whole NWO that was getting so much traction on the air.
Yeah, that's right. And again, I think the key thing for me is, as I mentioned a few minutes ago, the fact that this show, and again, I'm doing a lot of this off of memory when we talk about this particular show. In the book Nitro, really the underlying sort of theme of the book is really the relationship between Turner Broadcasting and WCW. And of course, in the book, we cover the salient creative points as we go as well, but it's not that's not the main focus. But I think when I think back on this show and this time frame and everything that was going on within the company, it certainly more than served its purpose of just increasing that interest in the NWO storyline, making it seem even more improbable that WCW was going to come back from a creative standpoint and overcome these odds. This invading entity is getting stronger and stronger week by week, month by month. And as I mentioned before, just so many themes and sort of things that can branch off from this show, whether it's the introduction of Roddy Piper, the element of Sting, becoming that elusive, lonesome character, as we mentioned before. Questions as to what's going to happen with Randy Savage, and obviously we know as we get into 97, he takes a turn in terms of where his character ends up. So just so much going on, so much unpredictability, so much chaos, I think, happening within the context of these shows from a positive standpoint. WCW did a really good job in the first couple of years of Nitro and the pay-per-views as well, of just really creating that feel that anything could happen. And as we know, a lot of times that was because behind the scenes, things were changing at a very rapid rate, and plans were getting tore up and rethought out and so on. So just a great time to go back and look at from the standpoint of a fan.
So let's get into the card itself. The show kicks off with a production piece promoting the main event. I noticed they left out the Savage Liz drama angle. I don't know if you remember this, the Liz sitting on a swing that Randy had made for her in a tree, pouring her heart out and how much she still loves Randy. And this being an Eric brainchild, to generate some extra drama for the main event, they left that portion out of it. They just kept it up with the heat between Savage and Hogan. The ring itself is themed with Slim Jim corners. A mat has Slim Jim logos on it, and the announce position is different for this pay-per-view. Now, this is an announce table they'll continue to use just with, with a logo for each one of the additional pay-per-views that they keep using this for. Also matching Halloween Havoc polos I saw for your announcers, Dusty Rhodes, Tony Schiavone, and Bobby the Brain Heenan. Now, this one thing that I felt was missed out because a lot of the times the picture-in-picture treatment did not add in any kind of entrance video aspect of it, the way you sometimes will see happening at pay-per-views nowadays where they're sort of almost movie production. However, every one of the wrestlers has a Halloween treatment to their usual entrance vignettes. And it's a shame that with this pay-per-view still being sort of in its infancy, that this little piece of awesome production was sort of left out of the final product, or the product that aired over the airwaves here. Now, your first match of the night is Dean Malenko defeating Rey Mysterio Jr. to win the WCW Cruiserweight Championship. This match was 18 minutes, 32 seconds long. It started off with a lot of speed. After getting the mask back, Rey swaps it out in the middle of the ring. I thought that was kind of a ballsy move considering the import that Mike Tenay has been stressing on that mask since he joined WCW's roster of announcers.
Yeah, and I think, you look at this match, pretty typical for this era to start out with. I mean, you could pick seemingly any two wrestlers from that locker room, right? There's just an endless combination, whether it's Malenko and Mysterio, or you throw, as time goes on, Hoovy in there, or Psychosis, or Kidman, or all of these great performers. Even so many people that you end up just forgetting about, like the Ultimo Dragons of the world. You could, again, throw seemingly any two wrestlers together to begin a show. And it reminds me very much of something that we talked about in the book. Kevin Sullivan in the book goes into the importance of starting the show with an actual wrestling match. That was something that was very important to their sort of overall creative philosophy and formula back then. Is you actually make sure that as soon as possible you get into, either a high-flying match or a technical match, or just something for the audience to get their teeth into quickly. And again, that's something that WCW did very well at this particular time. And anytime I go back and watch a Dean Malenko match, I think you appreciate more as you get older just how good he was and how skilled he was, maybe to an extent that you didn't necessarily appreciate it the first time around.
Yeah, I would agree with that. Dean Malenko was an absolute mat technician, amazing performer as far as the matches go. My lone criticism of Dean Malenko is his lack of charisma when doing a promo. There was one gear and one gear only. It was intensity, which didn't always serve the programs that he was in. In this case, it absolutely served because the entire tension that had developed between Malenko and Mysterio lended itself to putting over Dean Malenko's more, they coined him the Iceman for a reason. There was one gear and one gear only for him doing promos. It's which is a shame because of the fact that, like you said, he performs in the ring so well.
Yeah, and I think part of his his versatility was so impressive. Also, he could be in there with a Rey Mysterio. You could put him in there with a Chris Benoit. You could put him in there with almost anyone on the card, I would say, except for those the heavyweights that was sort of in perpetuity on top of the card at WCW. Those 12 or 14 names that never really went anywhere. If you look at how things developed over the years. So just incredibly versatile, incredibly reliable, someone who is very believable in the ring. As you said, maybe outside of the ring didn't necessarily have the same appeal, but just I think you could pull up any Dean Malenko match from this time period and just be pretty much blown away.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, Mike Tenay is on some sort of 1-800-COLLECT connection here. There are mixed reviews on this one. He was either in the production truck or he literally was not in the actual arena for this match. He informs us via his shitty connection, that this is in fact a rubber match between Malenko and Mysterio, who have 2 wins apiece against one another. Which again, I'm not quite sure this match needed that on top of the mask and all the drama going on back and forth, but it was an interesting little tidbit of information. There was an interesting little spot here as Mysterio and Malenko take bumps outside of the ring from the top rope. We get a good shot of Bill Apner at ringside taking photos with a Halloween Havoc t-shirt stretched over his customary shirt and tie as he's taking photos at ringside. Mysterio did a decent job of getting the crowd back into the match as both of them tumbled to the outside, and there was a bit of a lull in the match where the crowd started to kind of put on their own show. But in the end, Malenko wins with a very cool gut-wrench powerbomb from the middle turnbuckle that I don't think we saw a lot of wrestlers willing to put themselves in a situation where they were going to put themselves into that kind of a move. Mysterio did manage to whip his torso around so that he ate it the proper way on his shoulders, but I think if Malenko had tried this on anyone that was perhaps larger than him or weighed as much as he did, that probably would not have turned out as well as it ended up looking in this match.
Yeah, and as you're describing that, Dave, and I'm just going back through it in my head, what comes to mind is the fact that on a WCW card at this time, you would have a match like this to start the show, but think about the variety that's going to occur over the next 2 or 3 hours as you're going to describe it. So many different styles, so many different types of wrestlers, types of matches. I think one of my criticisms of contemporary wrestling, and I don't profess to be an expert when it comes to that at all, but from what I see is often you have events which are full of the same kind of match. So you might have a Dean Malenko, Rey Mysterio style, opener, and then that may very well be followed by 3 matches that are essentially, fairly similar in terms of their pace, their style, the moves that are used, etc. But as you mentioned, there were so many moves that you were seeing in this match that were very novel to a North American audience and most people at the time generally. So, pretty much every match you were seeing something that you had never seen before. And it was before, as I said, this style became emulated so much to the point where it's almost, I would argue, kind of the, one of the default sort of match types that we would expect from modern wrestling. But what a great way to start the show.
Yeah, absolutely. After this, we get a Lee Marshall promo with Jeff Jarrett on the interview set backstage. I'm not a huge fan of Jeff Jarrett doing his little chuckle. I understand why it's there. It's a throwback to old school wrestling promos. But let's talk about Lee Marshall's golden fucking voice at this point. And he passed away due to esophageal cancer. But I just, as much as on my regular Nitro shows, I bust his chops for doing those 1-800 collect call-in spots on Nitro. He was a phenomenal commentator and interviewer, and I really don't feel like he gets the credit that he's owed, even though at one point he was the voice of Tony the Tiger.
No, you're right, and it's the one thing that you can't teach, from an announcer's standpoint, is the voice. I mean, the guy just had an incredible voice, and one that would just cut through. If you remember, as time goes on, and WCW expands to TBS with the Thunder Show, he was one of the announcers on that show, and no matter how loud the crowd was or whatever craziness was happening in the ring, his voice would always grab your attention and cut through everything else. And it's interesting, those those promos that everyone loves to joke about, that he would, ostensibly send in on a weekly basis. That was something I remember talking to Neil Pruitt about this. Neil was actually the voice of the NWO, and a feature producer was his title. He was a senior feature producer with WCW, and I remember Neil telling me, that was something that Lee would do in the next room. He would go into the next room to quote unquote call those in. And I believe they had a device that they would attach to the phone to kind of make it seem like he was calling in from somewhere else. But always fun to see Lee Marshall in any capacity, and very sad that he's no longer with us.
Yeah, I mean, and again, the technology for all this was in its infancy. Yeah, you can hear that Guy and I are not obviously in the same room, unless, of course, I've hopped on a plane to do this show, which I can assure you I did not. Definitely not in our production budget, but the fact that technology has come so far that you can have two people on ostensibly different sides of the world doing something like this really speaks to the fact that they really did. I don't want to say they reinvented the wheel here, but they did do an interesting job of both promoting something that they had a corporate tie-in with, as well as making it sound as though Lee Marshall was on the other side of the country promoting next week's Nitro when in fact he was in studio. My only criticism of this was that it pulled him away from being able to do any kind of back in the locker room promos or do anything else live on Nitro other than this call-in spot for the time that he was doing it.
Yeah, and I think it also speaks to the level of detail and the care that the production staff were putting into these shows. Before it got to a point where I think everyone within the company, having spoken to them for the book, was completely burned out and wore down. Once Nitro went to 3 hours, remember it started as a 1 hour show,
Yep.
went to 2 hours in May of '96, then we get to 3 hours in '98. And then you add the Thunder show on top of that, all of the syndicated programming, the pay-per-views. It just became too much. But at this time, I think a lot of these concepts were new enough, and WCW being sort of the cool, hot wrestling company at the time, was enough to really propel people to go the extra mile and sort of make something that could have been on its face, something that you would fast forward to. Make it a little bit goofy, a little bit funny, make it memorable, make it something that you would want to, bring a friend around and rewind the tape and show them and have a laugh about it. I know that they definitely put in, a lot of thought even to sort of small chunks of the show that maybe you would think would just be sort of overlooked. And that's something that I appreciate, looking back at the product at this time is really the influence of the production people. I think a lot of times, those of us who watch back then, we get sucked into the creative stuff, creative view of things. How would we book this? How would we book that? What were they thinking with this storyline? But doing the book really gave me an appreciation for the production people and just how essential they are to the whole process as well.
Well, the thing to throw back to that, and I'm aware that there's a bit of a tangent for the show and everything, but I think a lot of the times when you get production staff killing themselves to put over a product, as it were, I think if I'm presuming to think for the production staff, that once they were on top, that more production staff would be hired in order to take some of the load off of the already overworked staff that was going on. But like you said, they're adding in Thunder, they're adding in more pay-per-views, they're adding in more content, but they essentially kept the same core production staff who, like you said, were already by this point getting a little bit burned out doing some of these little pieces. And today, with today's product, AEW and with WWE, there's a production staff for each one of the shows. So to avoid this kind of thing coming, do you think that perhaps other companies are learning from the errors that Eric and WCW made at the time overworking their staff?
Well, I think it was a function more so of what was happening within Turner. I mean, you're accurate in saying that they did not have a commensurate increase in the number of production staff as to reflect the additional demands on their time and on their respective schedules. They did add a number of people as time went on, but not enough really to keep up that same quality of programming. And a lot of that was because of, and we go into this in the book, some of the budget restrictions that WCW was under, especially once you get into '98 and '99. The company really wasn't given the adequate resources to really go out and have separate, teams for Nitro, for Thunder, for all of these other shows. Now you can sort of sit back and make an argument. Maybe that's something that WCW itself could have pushed more for. But the fact of the matter is, I think that, as we mentioned, there was a burnout factor. There was, you did get to a point where a lot of people could not really put forth the same amount of energy as they had at the start. And just think about where we end up in the year 2001 when all of this finishes. You've got 5.5 years of an incredibly stressful work environment. being under pressure at all times in a live situation to make things work. As we know, wrestling is not a form of entertainment that has an off season. So yes, you can take sort of little vacations here or there, but essentially it's 52 weeks a year that you're being required to be at this level. So definitely not an easy job, and as I said, an underappreciated part of the business for sure.
Yeah. All right. So back to Havoc here. Following match is DDP defeating Eddie Guerrero in 13 minutes 44 seconds. Apparently, Dusty decides that at this point, as the face commentator, he's going to put DDP over throughout the entire match, leaving everyone else speechless, trying to figure out what he was saying and how they were going to respond to it. At one point, Heenan started putting over Guerrero because they were confused as to which positions they were actually playing in. Whereas Tony, who normally takes on the role of being everyone's cheerleader, decided to go straight on to playing the straight man.
It's funny. I think somewhere people can follow our Twitter account for the book. It's WCW Nitro Book on Twitter. Somewhere in there, if you go through old tweets, you'll find we actually have a list of I think it's the 50 greatest Dusty Dusty moments on commentary. And people can go back and look at some of the funny clips of when he was on the headset. Wow, I mean, you think about that combination of Tony Schiavone, Heenan, and Dusty. Again, whatever your personal taste, whatever people may sort of think about that combination, just from a sheer entertainment factor, whether or not everyone was on the same page, whether or not it was communicated to them, who's the face, who's the heel, what's the story, is there a story? Just the fact that you have just such charisma and such entertainment sort of accompanying each match. For someone like myself who was really drawn into wrestling for the entertainment factor, I can't think of a more engaging and amusing, commentary team. So it doesn't surprise me in this match that things were kind of crisscrossed a little bit.
Things ended up being very much crisscrossed. It got to the point where Tony tries to bring the commentary around to the Battle Bull ring that DDP won, that Eddie had won from him, and remarking that DDP doesn't have it, that Eddie doesn't have it, and now Dusty is going to talk about pride. And to make a point, Heenan tells a really bad joke that lands hard, but seemed to have actually smartened Dusty up because he got back on focusing on calling the actual match instead of verbally sparring with his co-hosts. I spent the majority of this match being entertained by the fact that DDP and Eddie were fantastic wrestlers putting on a fantastic match, while simultaneously listening to the commentary team essentially turn into grown children who were sort of, I guess, really enjoying the match in the way that we would have at home, I think.
Yeah, that's right. And, I think what I would add to that, you're talking about the Battle Ball ring and where DDP was in his character at this time. Just think about the fact this is October of '96, and think about where he's going to be in the spring of '97, the summer of '97. Main eventing pay-per-views against Randy Savage. It just really goes to show that when you have a hot storyline, when you have, again, as we mentioned before, momentum, seemingly you have the Midas touch, everything that you come up with turns to gold, just how quickly you can take someone from being, I think this is the second match on the card, to actually in a number of months, main eventing some of these pay-per-views. It's really, really quite incredible.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, DDP, despite the shit that he gets from time to time being Eric's neighbor, grew up watching wrestling, was essentially a bouncer and a strip club manager and a bar manager. Didn't really get into wrestling until he was in his late 30s, early 40s. And here he is knowing as a fan the business, and then learning as an actual worker the business as a manager, and then going on to get his physique in shape to the point where he is doing matches against the likes of Johnny B. Bad and now Eddie Guerrero. I think you're right. In a couple more months, the fact that he's headlining pay-per-views with Savage and really, I mean, the NWO does carry a lot of the weight of WCW's success, but the thing is that the main event itself, while it's the poster on the pay-per-view, people have to want to sit through 3 hours of wrestling. And in order to sit through 3 hours of wrestling, the mid-card has to be every bit as good as the main event is. And I think DDP, at this point in his career, granted this is the second match, but is really doing his job of putting the mid-card on the map, much as Savage did back in the 80s. The thing is that unlike Savage, DDP is going to get a shake at actually main eventing pay-per-views, whereas, back in the 80s, maybe Savage wasn't getting all those chances. It does, though. It speaks to perhaps having the Midas touch, also perhaps having good ideas, also perhaps having no qualms as to putting over other wrestlers. In this case, in this match, to end it off, Eddie takes the Diamond Cutter a little bit weird to end things off. Heenan and Schiavone remarked that the Diamond Cutter maybe didn't catch everything. But, of course, being the pro that Eddie Guerrero is and was, he protects the move, which doesn't happen anymore these days, and he eats the pin, even though perhaps that maybe he should have gone back and done another one to really catch it all or something like that, like they do in nowadays product. I found protecting the move, protecting someone's finisher, especially a finisher like the Diamond Cutter that is getting so much traction and so much heat at this point, was a real pro move on Eddie's part.
Yeah, and I want to throw this to you, Dave, and ask you, a question on that one. So you mentioned the importance of protecting finishers back then, and obviously, if you look at today's wrestling, very, very different situation in terms of how finishers are used, how many times they're used, what they're used for, etc. So I think you're a little bit more clued into what's happening today than I am. So how do you, when you go back and look at the shows from this time period, and then you watch a modern show? I'm just interested to hear from your standpoint how things have changed in regards to how finishing moves are used.
Well, see, back in the old school way of wrestling, which the 90s is starting to strip away from a little bit, only because they're going a little more reality television. But in the ring, finishers are still, as their name implies, a finisher. Whereas signature moves are moves that are there to generate a pop. So they're interesting moves or interesting things or interesting, like Jeff Jarrett doing the Ric Flair strut, things to elicit a reaction from the crowd. It seems like nowadays finishers are being used as something to enact some sort of reaction out of the audience. Randy Orton, for example, his finisher, the RKO, which is absolutely the Diamond Cutter, and he admits it himself. That is actually probably one of the only protected finishers that I know of. Even the current WWE champion, Drew McIntyre, his finisher, the Claymore kick, doesn't finish people off. And not I don't mean doesn't finish off a guy like Brock Lesnar. It doesn't finish off a guy that he's bigger than. So
right.
I don't like because they've gotten away, WWE has gotten away from calling that move a finisher, even though in their video games they're still called finishers, and in their video games the finisher still effectively finishes a match. In the actual match itself, it's being used more as a prop than it is being used as actually something that fans are looking to finish the match off. Nowadays, I mean, don't get me wrong, it's not a criticism of the Young Bucks, but at one point a super kick from Shawn Michaels ended a match. The Young Bucks use a tandem super kick that very rarely finishes a match. As a matter of fact, their tandem super kick becomes a super kick party, as they like to call it, which is followed up by about 5 or 6 more of them that, don't get me wrong, get a reaction out of the crowd, but they're not finishers, even though they're packaged and sold as finishers. So I guess my stance on it is really, to this point, whatever gets a reaction out of the crowd is okay, but they need to move away from calling it a finisher if it's not going to actually finish the match.
Interesting. Yeah, I would agree with a lot of that. So DDP is our winner in this match, correct?
DDP is our winner in this one in 13:44. A hell of a good match. Nice length of match, and got the fans really into the wrestling show. Much in the same way as the fans were sort of... I mean, we talked about how Kevin Sullivan was adamant that the first match on a card should be a wrestling match. And that'll be one of the things that I would absolutely agree with him on. The Dean Malenko-Rey Mysterio match had a lot of drama tied into it, whereas this one was more a straight-up wrestling match. There was very little in the way of drama going on during the match. No one, for example, tried to get their hands on the Battle Bowl ring. Right. There was no gimmick involved in this match. It was just straight up. These are two guys that hate each other that are going to go ahead and have a really good match together.
Yeah, and I think DDP, as we mentioned before, yes, there's that criticism of him that he was obviously close to Eric Bischoff, and perhaps that accounted for a lot of his quote unquote push and the opportunities that he got. But I think as many other wrestlers and personalities associated with WCW have mentioned over the years, you can be given the ball in wrestling, but you have to actually be able to run with it. And he was able to really make the most of all of the opportunities that he had around this time. Yes, there was, I think, a lot of goofy stuff with him, in sort of the preceding months and years prior to this point, where he was still finding himself and finding his character. But I think, this match, it was what it was, but it was another step in his development and his evolution to what we would see the following year, where we mentioned finishing moves. Look at the reaction to the Diamond Cutter as we get through 97 and 98. It just, it kind of became a huge phenomenon, all to itself. So interesting to go back and look at a match from this era of DDP.
Yeah, absolutely. After this match, we get Mike Tenay's Slim Jim Halloween Havoc Monster Truck draw, with Savage drawing the winner, Joan McCallick from Romulus, Michigan. I had no idea that there was a place called Romulus in Michigan. She did win, we would find out later in the pay-per-view, a road legal monster truck, which was essentially an F-350 that had been jacked up with large tires on it. Really a signature vehicle to have down south. Maybe not in Michigan, though.
Yeah, I would wonder if that's a real a real place name or not. Maybe someone can look that up. But I do know sometimes the production people would slip in either their hometowns, or they would come up with fictional names, or sometimes even the names of the winners themselves would be sort of an inside joke. So never heard of that place myself. Maybe we have a listener that's from there. They can email in and let us know.
There is absolutely a Romulus, Michigan. However, there is no Joan McCallick. Joan McCallick is an old school kayfabe name that they would give to, like Americans like to joke about having your Canadian girlfriend across the border. That was sort of the kayfabe wife name back in the day. If you were a wrestler and you're out at the bar and a girl approached you and you weren't at all interested in her, you would name your wife as Joan McCallick.
Is that right?
Yeah.
There you have it.
So I was actually kind of pleasantly surprised that the production team knew of that. Maybe one of the wrestlers told them about that or something. Ric Flair was fairly synonymous for breaking out Joan's name every now and then, because he really, while he loved to ride Space Mountain, he did not like the fatties. Now, we also go to the CompuServe internet jungle, where WCW's Halloween Havoc 96 is the first pay-per-view that they are simulcasting over their website. Now, from an audio engineering standpoint, this is a fairly simple thing. You plug a microphone into a switcher or a mixer. From an internet standpoint, this is incredibly difficult. Remember, this is a time of dial-up modems, and audio takes up quite a bit of bandwidth as far as a old school modem goes. I mean, granted, they were rocking the highest tech 56K modems and the most iconic high-tech laptops, while Chris Jericho is yelling and pushing around some nerd to talk to somebody online, chatting in this CompuServe chat room for WCW's Halloween Havoc 96.
It's funny. As you were saying that, it got me thinking about in the process of writing the book. Of course, I was sort of researching everything I possibly could and casting a very wide net. And one of the materials that I actually was able to come across was a lot of the old audio from the website. So I actually have quite a lot of stuff that's not out there, that's still actually in analog format, that was recorded on tapes. So at some point in time, I'll have to get around to figuring out exactly everything that's on there. But I just want people to know some of those internet broadcasts actually did survive, believe it or not, all of these years later.
That would be a hilarious little podcast in and of itself.
Mm-hmm.
Now, after this, we get another Mike Tenay interview segment, this time with Malenko. He's going to thrill us with his charisma of what a wrestling promo should be. I will say, when Mike Tenay is the most charismatic person in the shot, you really know that you're in shit. Now, opposite of that, we get a DiBiase promo who is absolutely charismatic with the Giant, not so much, out in the crowd leading up to his Jeff Jarrett match. This is how the NWO would enter the ring during Havoc 96. They would appear in the crowd, as the Outsiders synonymously came into the company doing. But what they would do is DiBiase would come out, he'd cut a promo with whoever was going to be coming down to the ring, in this case the Giant, and tell the person that this wrestler of theirs is going to be getting in the ring with that he is going to get summarily trounced. So we get the Giant defeating Jeff Jarrett by disqualification in 14 minutes, 42 seconds. Another really good match. Flair comes down to the ring to be in Jarrett's corner. And I was actually a little bit taken aback at how little Flair wanted to do this backstage and yet really looked like he was having a lot of fun with it when he was out there.
Yeah, that doesn't surprise me. Once you get the Nature Boy out there in front of the crowd, but I think again, I'm thinking back off memory here, Dave. You'll have to help me out. But wasn't the reason that Flair had suffered an injury? Because I think the original matchup was Flair and the Giant originally. Is that right?
Yeah. So originally it was supposed to be Flair versus the Giant for the U.S. title. Flair had been on tour in Japan and had legitimately injured his left shoulder and elbow in a match with who the heck was it? I can't remember now off the top of my head. Shit. No, I can't remember the name of the guy he hurt himself in the match with. An honest, not one of those accidentally on purpose things, an honest actual injury. WCW not wanting to have the U.S. title just sort of be vacant or be not defended. Eric's dream at this point was to sort of have all the titles be held by NWO members to really put over the NWO as a legitimate force. Later on, that would, of course, happen, but it wouldn't happen until Starrcade. And even then, the Giant wasn't technically the U.S. champion either. He just possessed the belt. Because at this point, Giant actually did have the U.S. title, although he was not the actual U.S. champion. He had just taken it off of Flair when the NWO had attacked Flair last week on Nitro. This wasn't covered very well on Nitro, but it was explained in more detail on Halloween Havoc.
Yeah, and personally, I was never a big fan of the Giant being in the NWO. I mean, that angle on Nitro where he turned was pretty incredible. If you go back and look at the crowd heat and just the reaction to that moment, it's one of the best clips, I think, to pull up from the whole Nitro era. In fact, I remember talking to someone within Turner who was not necessarily a huge WCW fan about that, and I remember them saying that they would that they had actually been in a meeting where someone at WCW was showing that precise moment on a VHS tape to a group of people, and kind of like, this is what our company is, this is what we're doing, we're not just the same old wrestling, and just being very impressed by it. But after that, I think to me anyway, at least, it didn't quite fit, and I always liked him more as one of the baby faces leading the WCW contingent. Even though it's kind of awkward, I suppose, having someone of that stature, portraying the role of an underdog at times. But I always liked the combination of him and Luger and Sting and DDP, and Piper being the WCW guys, battling back against the NWO. So it's, as you'll see on your show as time goes on, just a couple of months after this, he's switching back to be on the other side again.
Yeah, that'll actually happen on the heels of Starrcade 96. As much shit as I like to give Kevin Sullivan on this show, this is actually one of his brainchildren, because at the time before the Giant joined the NWO, he was part of the Dungeon of Doom. And so he was a heel, and Giant taking on Hogan or Giant taking on Savage was your usual heel face dynamic. Putting the Giant into the NWO was a way of removing him out of the Dungeon of Doom and then having him turn his back on the NWO and get ostensibly beat out of the NWO was their way of turning him face. They couldn't figure out another believable way of turning the Giant into a face because, like you said, the Giant as the babyface, the Giant as the member of the WCW faithful became a better angle for Paul White to be in than being the mean old Giant that was part of the Dungeon of Doom for so many, well, I guess for a couple of years anyways.
Yeah, and I think, in the end, it didn't affect his popularity. If you look at '97, as they say, he was incredibly, over on the show to the audience. So I think, there was another turn of his, spring of '98, which was kind of, I think, did a lot to damage his sort of drawing power. But obviously, shortly after that, he was gone to the WWF anyway. But certainly that makes a lot of sense. And as I say, he was, I think, certainly one of the crowd favorites into the following year.
Absolutely. Now, Flair, being Flair, gets his hands on a live mic at ringside to cheer on Jarrett and to catcall the NWO. The Giant delivers 2 backbreakers to Jeff Jarrett while staring at Flair and mouthing, "This is for you," that none of the announce team manages to catch, even though they're all watching the match pretty much right there at ringside. Jarrett throws the figure 4 on the Giant on the outside of the ring. Giant counters with a choke. Flair's had enough at this point, gives Giant a low blow, which Nick Patrick, Mr. Heel Ref, actually sees and calls for the DQ, giving Giant the W, but still not technically the U.S. champ since you can't win a title on a disqualification. Not that in WCW in the mid-90s we're hung up on the rules of wrestling.
No, I think they played very loose and fast with the rule book at times, definitely in the NWO era, that's for sure.
After this, DiBiase puts over Jericho just before introducing Six and another one of these NWO introducing their members' gimmick spots. Six also puts Jericho over because that's apparently what heels do now. So this is part of the problem, though. I mean, yeah, okay, maybe DiBiase and Six believe on a personal level that Jericho is really great, and maybe Sullivan and Eric want to protect Chris and his growing popularity with the fans by even having heels say how amazing he is. But heels should always try to bury faces, always, because otherwise it confuses fans, and even in Vegas, this would be confusing.
Yeah, I'd be interested to know. I have a feeling that there may be a little bit more to that, because I know if you talk to wrestlers, a lot of times they'll mention that if they go out of their way, especially if they're playing the role of a heel, to put over their opponent, a lot of times it's because behind the scenes, in real life, so to speak, personally, they feel like that particular person is maybe at a level that if they were to completely annihilate them verbally, maybe that would severely hamper their career. And, maybe they have a lot of respect for them and are trying to help them in that sense. So I would imagine maybe, we're going back 24 years and sort of hypothetically trying to figure out the rationale for this promo, but that could very well have been the reason there, because I think, Chris Jericho, even though you look at his character, in '96 upon his introduction to WCW, you probably, if you were to just look at that in isolation, you wouldn't necessarily extrapolate that from that he's going to become this this mega star in a few years' time and be on top in the WWF. But at the very least, I think everyone saw the potential and the ability at such a young age for him to be, an incredibly important person in the wrestling business.
Yeah, absolutely.
How surreal and how crazy is it that here we are talking at the end of 2020, and this guy is still on top in the business. It's really pretty amazing.
Yep, absolutely. Six ends up getting the W here against Chris Jericho in 9 minutes 49 seconds. After some back and forth with Chris Jericho and the crowd, we get a camera shot of why he's mouthing off the crowd, and here's Conan in his Cholo Heisenberg ring paraphernalia, Big Bubba and Sullivan catcalling from ringside. After Jericho lights up Six, Tony mentions Jericho's dad, Ted Irvine, and his NHL career with many teams, to which Heenan quips, well, if he's so good, why'd they keep trading him? Fuck. I just love Heenan and his little... Between him and Dusty, these little things are fantastic.
Mm-hmm.
Nick Patrick played up the neck injury, sometimes resulting in all 3 commentators counting up until 6, until, ironically enough, Six gets a quick count victory, which serves everything they had going during this entire match, including the Nick Patrick sort of kind of NWO referee gimmick they were working on.
Yeah, that was it's kind of weird to see how long that was drawn out with Nick Patrick, and I think that was again, it's not something I really go into in the book. If people haven't picked it up, the Nitro book, it's not necessarily. I mean, I say not necessarily. I don't think it's at all infused, hopefully, with my sort of opinions of what was happening creatively, but just putting myself in the standpoint of a fan. Or in the seat of a fan, that was something that I thought was goofy at times and kind of drawn out and played out. Um, and anytime I see Nick Patrick in the ring, I can't help but think about the Starcade '97 debacle and everything that happened there. But we're getting ahead of ourselves.
Oh, yes. Post-match, Jericho gets in Nick Patrick's face and would eventually fight Nick Patrick in a match at the next pay-per-view, World War III, with one arm tied behind his back.
Mm-hmm.
Mike Tenay has a promo after this in the interview area with Luger, who appears to have had his hair blown out. My mom in the 90s would get this done from time to time, and it was to get her Cindy Crawford look on. But Luger, I'm not quite sure it got the same job done. This is about the kind of promo you expect out of Luger, but I will say this, at least it was delivered with passion as well as titty flexing.
You said it.
Luger defeats Arn Anderson in his match after this. This is a return bout from World War III, or not World War III, from the, what was it, the battle? Their goofy little four horsemen battle deal that they had, where Luger and Sting were paired up with Anderson and Flair, and Anderson's been on Luger since their loss to the NWO in this match as having dropped the ball. So this is their, I don't know, I guess blow-off match, for lack of a better term. This match is 12 minutes, 22 seconds. Arn Anderson comes out rocking his hog wild sleeveless jean jacket, which was all right. It's very 90s. I'll give him that. Sullivan, Conan, and Bubba are still at ringside for this match. Sullivan being loud enough that you could hear him on the live mic and the announcers comment on it. I mean, when there's 10,000 people in attendance, you shouldn't be able to hear one guy, even if his voice does carry. So unfortunately, this match just wasn't getting the crowd reaction I would think they were hoping for.
No, you're right, and I think we talked about the trajectory of different characters as we got later into '96 and '97, and some of the reactions that the Giant, DDP, etc. would get. Luger is someone that I think, in kind of a surprising fashion, if you look at the end of his WWF tenure and some of his sort of the storylines he was involved in to this point back in WCW. You look at how over he was in '97 and how the crowd reacted to the torture rack, and obviously no one would ever compare him to to Dean Malenko as far as technical prowess goes, but for this time and for his place on the card, I think most of the time he gave what was needed, but probably not the best position for him to be in a 12-13 minute match at this point in the card. And I think, as you said, you saw that with the lack of crowd reaction.
Yeah, you also see it with some of his basic botching of simple moves. I will grant you that maybe not everybody has had any kind of wrestling training, but Luger fucks up a very basic catapult of Anderson on the outside of the ring into the corner post. And really, in order to do this catapult move, you hold the guy's legs, you put your knees into his ass cheeks, and then you just fall on your back. They have to do the rest of it. And because of his lack of knee placement, Anderson essentially had to get up and then jump into the corner post, leading to a rather embarrassing thing that the fans, of course, would not let them forget that it had been screwed up. Now, granted, fans don't chant "you fucked up" like they do nowadays, but the crowd reaction to that one was fairly low key. Now, Anderson racks up Anderson and refuses to let go until his theme is cut off. Then the bell rings again after Luger had already let Anderson go. So the production team, while doing a decent job, the ring crew was not paying attention to what was actually going on in the ring. An inordinate amount of time was spent with Dusty's "bula bula" comment, which will come back to haunt us later on, which was not necessarily meant to be racist, but actually got an awful lot of heat for being somewhat racist because he used it later on in the Harlem Heat match.
I didn't catch that one. Dave, just give me 1 second, okay? I just need a quick timeout here. I'll be back in 1 second.
No problem. I'll cover up airtime for you.
Okay, I'll be right back. Hold on.
Post-match, Flair and Jarrett come out to join the trainer in the ring and get a ton of heat from the crowd. The stretcher comes out. They roll Anderson. An excruciating amount of time was spent rolling Anderson out to the stretcher, though, of course, to sell the injury that he sustained from Luger to his back while Luger held onto that torture rack for an extra long period of time. This, well, we're going to go back to this whole Bula Bula thing in a second because it came up again while Anderson was being helped out to the stretcher, though at this point it hadn't coalesced in any kind of, shall we say, racially insensitive areas yet, but it would. So Lee Marshall then has a promo in the locker room for the WCW hotline. He apparently has news about Sting, even though there was no news about Sting. This was a fairly common thing for the WCW hotline to do. That was one of Gene Okerlund's brain children. Often on the WCW hotline, very little was divulged that was not divulged on the air. And as WCW would begin to do more and more breaking of the kayfabe rules, the WCW hotline would become even less and less accurate. He calls in the Harlem Heat. Colonel Parker and Sherry get to cut a fairly forgettable promo leading up to their, I guess, match later. After this, we get Steve McMichael and Chris Benoit with Woman and Deborah McMichael defeating the Faces of Fear, Meng and Barbarian in 9 minutes, 23 seconds. This was one of the best matches on the card, in my opinion.
Dave, we may just have to do a quick edit here. I've got to run in about 10 minutes. Is that enough time, do you think, for us to jump through?
We can rack her up by then.
Okay, perfect. So I'm sorry, can you just set that up again real quick?
We got Steve McMichael and Chris Benoit defeating the Faces of Fear with probably arguably one of the better matches on the card.
Yeah, I think, we can perhaps put Mongo to the side, but when you think about the combination of people in that ring, Meng, and Chris Benoit and the Barbarian, having them all in the same ring, it's going to be a hard-hitting contest. You know that they're going to really try to sell the action as believable. It's going to be physical. It's going to be heavy-hitting. So, I think to most fans today, when they see the name Mongo, they're probably thinking about the clips on social media that have been sent out of a lot of his action, shall we say, in the ring. But I always enjoyed, the Faces of Fear, and whoever they were matched up with, you always knew it was going to be a pretty entertaining and definitely a different matchup on the card.
Absolutely. I mean, to your point, Tony tries to put over Mongo as having made a great transition from the NFL to the ring. Has he, though? Has he really? The teams couldn't agree who should go in the heel corner. Now, again, there was legit heat between Benoit and Sullivan at this point. So Benoit and Mongo end up in the heel corner. Since Sullivan is sitting close to the face corner was my sort of read on the situation. I could be stretching a little bit here, but it would seem to stand to reason that the Faces of Fear, being members of the dungeon, would sit closer to their leader.
You could be right, and I guess, Dave, that's the selling point of your show. You're picking up on these nuances, which I don't think necessarily come to mind. So you could be right. You could be on something there. Hey,
Mongo did break out a new move in this match, though. After Meng does a sumo ready stance, Mongo tries to mimic it and manages to botch that too.
Yeah, it's not too surprising.
I was wrong about the Bula Bula. It was not in the Heat match. It was actually in this match because Tony starts questioning what language it is that Meng and Barbarian speak to one another. Now, Heenan quips that maybe they're speaking Tonese and perhaps he's ordering his sister to go build the shelter, and her name was Bula Bula.
Oh, boy.
Oh, dear. The 90s really were a different time.
Isn't that the truth?
Oh, good Lord. Now, post-match, Meng nails Mongo with the Halliburton. Sullivan also nails Mongo with the Halliburton, which I imagine was satisfying. There was at one point a very tense scene here where Sullivan takes the lead in beating down a prone Benoit after screaming at woman that, Hart screams at woman that had she called him Friday night like she was supposed to, this wouldn't be happening. Sullivan takes off his dress shirt and tells Nancy he's going to show her why he's still the man. Oh, God. I actually do cringe that kayfabe was being busted open this badly by one of the guys running the book. After this, we get a DiBiase promo in the crowd again, this time introducing the Outsiders as the Outsiders take on the Harlem Heat to win the WCW World Tag Team titles. That being said, the match itself was good, I thought. My only criticism of this is how much selling Scott Hall has to do because of Nash's bad legs.
Yeah, I remember this being a pretty good match as well. I mean, that was, I think, one of the strengths of WCW at this time was the tag team division. I know that, Eric Bischoff personally wasn't the biggest fan of tag team wrestling, but you had a lot of really interesting, teams and combinations that you could throw out here. And I think obviously Booker, as time goes on, really becomes the standout as we get into the last year and a half, year or so of WCW really takes hold as a singles wrestler. But I always enjoyed him and Stevie as a team. I thought that this was a good match and a good way to set up the main event.
Absolutely. Speaking of the main event, this is where we're at. Hogan starts off by doing his pre-match promo, again from the crowd. Everyone is commenting on his new hair. If you remember, he was wearing a wig from Santos with Muscles. Jesus. Heenan quips that perhaps they're just nerve ends. And then later on quips that Hogan must have used a half gallon of Rogaine. Oh, God, I love fucking Bobby the Brain Heenan. At this point, Hollywood Hogan defeats Randy Savage in 18 minutes, 37 seconds. This was actually a very, very good main event. There are times when Hogan is in the main event and the match itself sort of suffers, but as far as matches themselves go, this was fantastic. Lots of involvement with Liz coming out in a dress that couldn't possibly even been fashionable in the 80s. DiBiase, Six. There was a lot of giant interference as well in this, as well as Nick Patrick coming down and getting involved in the match. Ultimately, this match itself was fantastic. However, what everyone remembers is not the match, but that bagpipes play over the PA system as Piper comes down to cut an impromptu 5-minute promo on Hogan that gets cut off because, he kind of fucked up and mentioned WrestleMania, and there was already cease and desist orders going on between the companies at the time.
That's interesting. I didn't remember that. I do remember obviously the promo and the fact that we went off the air while the promo was still in progress, which is definitely different. I can't think of another pay-per-view, at least from this time, where something like that happened. But as we mentioned earlier, this is just another way to put fuel on the fire. I think that although Savage has been unsuccessful in taking down Hogan, it seems like the NWO is just getting stronger and stronger. All of a sudden now here comes Roddy Piper, and at this point in his career, obviously there was going to be a certain shelf life, I think, to Piper's involvement in WCW, and I think a lot of the novelty factor did wear off as time went on, but definitely a very unexpected development, and just again something that really reinforced that perception that anything can happen on these shows, and that whole feeling of who's going to be the next person to show up. Obviously, the downside to that is you can only go to that well so many times before everyone who can jump or everyone who is a free agent can actually appear. But I thought it was a really exciting and great way to end the show.
I agree, absolutely. Now, listen, we are at the end of the podcast. I want to thank you again, Mr. Guy Evans, for coming on to the podcast to give your insight into WCW as well as Halloween Havoc 96. If you are at all a wrestling fan, never mind a WCW fan, go check out WCWNitroBook.com. Buy the book. It's freaking good. Believe me, I'm picky as hell on what I read.
Well, I appreciate that, Dave, and I appreciate the invite. And hopefully we can do this again at some point. And as you mentioned, people can go to wcwnitrobook.com. You can also go to Amazon and just type in Nitro Book. In fact, the full name is Nitro: The Incredible Rise and Inevitable Collapse of Ted Turner's WCW. We also have an Audible version that was published earlier this year. So if you have the Audible app, or again, you want to search online for that, you can check that out. And actually, people can expect next year that there's going to be some big news about a follow-up to the book as well. So hopefully at that point, we can sit down and talk again.
Sounds great, man. Thanks again.
Okay, thank you. Have a great day.
Well, that was an abortion of a show. Should the mood take you, check out markoutradio.com and leave a comment. You can also find links there to our Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, and Stitcher channels. You can even leave a voicemail on our Skype. Just click the links and share them.